In this video, I'm going to walk through what a comma splice is, and my goal is to not just give everyone an understanding of this particular concept, but to also give us some tips about how to avoid it and to also think about how the grammatical concept of the comma splice connects to other grammatical concepts. The first thing I want to talk about is why we should focus on comma splices when we talk about grammatical concepts and grammatical errors and how to fix them. So I have two basic reasons for focusing on the comma splice. The first is that it is one of the most common grammatical errors in the English language. It is incredibly common. And once we start looking for it, we start to find it in all different kinds of formats and sources. The second reason that I focus on comma splices is that a comma splice is actually a cluster of grammatical concepts. What I mean by that is that in order to understand what a comma splice is, we actually need to grasp several other grammatical concepts. So those are my two main reasons for focusing on comma splices when talking about grammar right now. All right, the first thing I want to give everyone is the definition of a comma splice. Here is the formal definition. A comma splice is a grammatical error when a comma is incorrectly used to separate two or more independent clauses. I will say that a second time just so the words start to seep into the back of our minds and we start to really think about the definition itself. Again, a comma splice is a grammatical error when a comma is incorrectly used to separate two or more independent clauses. It is perfectly okay if this definition is confusing for right now. I'm actually not going to talk about that definition directly at this moment. I'm going to break down the parts of that definition and then we are going to go back to it. So let's start breaking that definition down. One of the main words that is included in that definition is a clause. A clause is simply a part of the sentence that separates a single thought. It is a unit of the sentence. There are two main kinds of sentence clauses. The first is an independent clause. With an independent clause, it can stand on its own. That means that if you took that clause and you made it its own sentence, it would still make sense. The second kind of clause is a dependent clause. Now, this is when a clause cannot stand on its own. If you took that sentence or if you took that clause and you made it its own standalone sentence, it wouldn't make sense because something is left out. Now, I want us to look at an example, and I'm going to use this example as a way to unpack the definition more and to think about what dependent clauses are and what independent clauses are in a little bit more of a specific way. Here is our example. I went to the store, comma, because I needed milk. This example has two main clauses or sections. Clause number one is I went to the store. Now, if you took this clause and you made its own standalone sentence, it would still make sense. If an individual came to you and said, I went to the store, you know what happened. You know what they are talking about. Because of that, this is an independent clause. The second part of the sentence is because I needed milk. If someone came up to you and said simply, because I needed milk, your response might be something along the lines of, wait, what? So you wouldn't know what is going on. You would be confused. Something is left out. That sentence cannot stand on its own. For those reasons, this is a dependent clause. Now, the word that makes it a dependent clause is because. This is called a subordinating conjunction. A subordinating conjunction is any word that makes a clause dependent because it draws attention to how something else needs to be put in there. So if someone said, because I needed milk, it's the word because that makes you know that something is left out. Other words that function like this are while. All right, if someone said to you something along the lines of, while I was at the store, and that was it. That was the end of the sentence. You know that it is incomplete because of the word while. Since works the exact same way. Now, one of the tests that I mentioned before that you can use in order to identify a dependent clause versus an independent clause is the wait what test. If you look at a clause and you treat it on its own, so it's its own standalone sentence, and the immediate thought is wait what, so some sort of confusion, you know you are talking about a dependent clause instead of an independent clause. I want to play now with our example. I'm just going to tweak it a tiny bit. Here's our new example. I went to the store, comma, I needed milk. As with the previous example, we have two main clauses or sections. The first clause is I went to the store. This is unchanged, so it is an independent clause. If someone said to you, I went to the store, you are fine. You understand what is going on. The second part of the sentence is I needed milk. This is a little bit different. If someone came to you and said, I needed milk, you know what is going on. This is a clause that can actually stand on its own as a sentence. It has a subject, it has a verb, and it has an object. For those reasons, this is an independent clause. So with our new example, we have a two-clause sentence. Clause number 1 is independent. Clause number 2 is independent. Now, with all that in mind, I want to return to our definition of what a comma splice is. And this is what we began with in this video. A comma splice is a grammatical error when a comma is incorrectly used to separate two or more clauses. That means that this is our first example. We have independent clause number 1, independent clause number 2, combined with a comma. So we have an example in front of us. This is a grammatical error. And not only that, it is one of the most common grammatical errors in the English language. Once we find a comma splice in our own writing, there are a couple of very quick ways to fix it. Fix number 1 is to split it up into multiple sentences. So break the sentence apart, put a period, and make sure your capitalizations are correct. To go back to our example, I went to the store, comma, I needed milk, so this is our comma splice. We would get rid of that. We would break it up into two sentences, and we would have a period in the middle. That would produce, I went to the store, period, I needed milk. One of the things that you will want to be on the lookout if you start doing this with your comma splices is to make sure you are varying your sentences a little bit, because what you don't want to do is to create a bunch of sentences in a row that are very, very short, because that sort of tempo can get to a reader very, very quickly. If you were reading a paragraph that went along the lines of, I went to the store, I needed milk, I saw my friend Tim bought some cookies, he liked eating cookies. If you had every sentence like that, it gets to you after a while. So if you are going through and fixing your comma splices by breaking them up into smaller sentences, just be aware of the flow you may be producing. Quick fix number 2 is to use a semicolon. I know that many people are really concerned with how these work, but semicolons in the English language are basically used for two main things. The first is to break up items in a really, really long list. If you use the semicolon that way, you are basically using the semicolon as what is called a super comma. So it does the same thing as a comma. It's just that the list is a little bit longer and the semicolon makes it a little bit easier to track everything. The second main use of a semicolon is to break up independent clauses. So a semicolon can do what a comma cannot. I want to go back to our original comma splice. I went to the store, comma, I needed milk. If we use the semicolon, we are going to get rid of that. We know it's a comma splice, we know it's wrong. And we are going to write instead, I went to the store, semicolon, I needed milk. In this example, we have the two independent clauses combined correctly with a semicolon instead of incorrectly with a comma. The third fix is to put in a subordinating conjunction. If we do this, basically we look at the two clauses side by side and we try to figure out what word or phrase would be best for making one of the clauses dependent. For example, if we go back to our original comma splice, I went to the store, comma, I needed milk, we could actually get rid of this, and we can fix it by going back to the correct version that we had early on in this video. We could take the word because, put it in that sentence, and it produces, I went to the store because I needed milk. A very quick tip, if you have a comma splice in front of you, and you know that you want to fix it by putting in a subordinating conjunction, but you're just not sure what subordinating conjunction makes the most sense, go online, Google it. You can search for many lists of subordinating conjunctions. They will give you all of the different options, and they will give you some context for how you can figure out which one fits the best. All right, now, I want to give everyone a final grammatical concept. One of the reasons I want to give everyone this one is because it is perhaps one of the most misused phrases when we talk about grammar. And odds are we have all heard about this grammatical error in one way or another. This is the run-on sentence. I know we all have probably heard of it. I'm going to talk about this in a particular way that may be confusing. A run-on sentence has absolutely nothing to do with the length of a sentence. Again, a run-on sentence has absolutely nothing to do with the length of a sentence. You can have a run-on sentence that is 4 words long. You can have a grammatically correct sentence that is 50 words long. All right? A run-on sentence is simply when 2 or more independent clauses are joined incorrectly. That's all it is. The comma splice is actually one version of a run-on sentence. All right, I'm going to give everyone an example that uses some of the examples that I've already talked about and thinks about it in terms of a run-on sentence. Here is our example. I went to the store, I needed milk. No punctuation in the middle. This is often called a run-on sentence or a fused sentence. Now, this example has 2 independent clauses. Clause number 1 is I went to the store. Clause number 2 is I needed milk, and they're simply thrown together. All right, they're fused. This is why a run-on sentence is often called a fused sentence. Here, we have an 8-word run-on sentence. So again, a run-on sentence doesn't have to do with the length. It has to do with how the clauses are combined. At this point, I've gone through a bunch of different concepts. I'm talking about what a comma splice is. We actually covered about 6 different concepts and definitions. The first one is obviously comma splices. We also talked about independent clauses and what they were, dependent clauses and what those were. We have covered subordinating conjunctions and how they can make a clause dependent. We've also covered semicolons and how they can be used in a sentence correctly. And then the last grammatical concept that I talked about was run-on sentences. In talking about what a comma splice is, we've talked about how all of these different grammatical concepts are connected to each other. I know that was a lot of information. However, if you want to read more, I'm giving everyone a couple of very quick links that we can go to. The first three are all from Grammarly. And you can click directly on the page and go to these web pages. There is a very useful Grammarly article on avoiding comma splices. There's a really good one on RunOn Sentences. And there's also a really good article done by Grammarly about semicolons. And the fourth resource is actually from a Business Insider article from a few years ago, because they talked about how common comma splices are becoming. And their idea is that they're becoming more and more common as people make their grammatical mistake in all these different forms. That is the end of this video. Hopefully it was helpful and gave everyone a lot of information about how to avoid comma splices and what they are.